if our child is not their behavior, and we as a parent are looking at their child and they're behaving in a certain way, it's great because we can say, okay, so they're having this behavior, whatever it is, and it's not who they are. But what do we do about that? Like, how do we deal with that behavior then? I mean, especially, where do we go with that?
I want to say, like, especially if it's something that looks like, we can put some labels on it. It looks like it's defiant or obstinate or purposeful, especially toddlers. I'm thinking, when they like look at you and they're like, I'm just going to take my bowl of cereal and dump it on the floor. Something like that you've talked to them about not doing. How do you handle that?
Yeah. So I think there's a few aspects to this. I think the first thing is to circle back to looking at the things we can control, because, when I say, okay, well, we can't control a toddler, we can influence them and we can have a positive influence or a negative influence, but still can be a little disconcerting. Like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Just throw in the towel, give up here, So one thing I want to say is like, focus on the things you can control, which are your own words and actions, the environment that you create. A lot of times we can make some adjustments to the environment, such as making certain things more accessible, certain things less accessible, to reduce power struggles and to help set limits in the environment. But when we have this type of behavior, it's so common as humans to put labels on it because, well, labels are how we make sense of the world, right? We label things to be able to describe it, to be able to make sense of it and categorize it in our brains. And it's part of an innate part of being human. And when we're labeling a child's behavior, then what we're doing is we're actually putting our interpretation on the behavior. So say the behavior is like, my child threw a book or through the remote control or something like this. So that's a behavior. But if we put a label on that behavior, the way we're interpreting it, we might say, oh, it's bad, it's defiant, it's obstinate. So I think there's just an opportunity to start looking at what is actually the behavior and what is actually our interpretation. And I know I haven't said anything yet about action-wise what to do, but I want to underscore that part of the work of parenting and caregiving and responding to children is to do our own work first and how we're relating to the behavior. And when we shift how we're relating to the behavior, it's really going to impact how we respond to the behavior.
Okay, so this is really an important point that you're making that I think can be really challenging for parents in identifying what is actually happening versus what we make it mean, what our interpretation is of that. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think sometimes when people are trying to figure that out, they're like, well, he's not listening. He's not listening. Yeah. Like that's what he's doing. That's the behavior. And that's like what's actually happening. But I think you're saying something different. Could you talk a little bit more about that and give some examples about that?
Yeah, I love it. So he's not listening. Sure. This is our interpretation of what's happening, and what the facts might be, or what is if we were like a news reporter and we were, just a third party kind of peeking in, we might say, oh, I asked my child to put on their shoes and they're still playing with their dinosaurs. But our interpretation of that behavior is my child's not listening. And when we interpret a behavior, when we relate to it as not listening, then we're thinking, okay, my child's being bad, obstinate, defiant, all of these things. So we're going to be more likely to respond in a way with less compassion, less teaching, and probably more punishments or some type of force or something like that there. And so what we want to do, on the other hand, is when we dial it back to this more neutral narration of what's happening and getting back to the facts or what is, oh, I asked my child to, I said, it's time to go. And my child's still playing with their dinosaurs. So then we look at, oh, okay, well, what can I do to have this go differently? So then you're going to probably respond in a more proactive way that prioritizes connection. And so you might get down on their level, maybe touch their arm or their shoulder to make some type of physical connection there and say, oh, you're playing with your dinosaurs. Look, you line them all up and it's time for us to go. Would you like to bring a couple with us in the car so you can continue playing with them? Something like that. So for a transition, I always like to bridge the gap by bringing something from the current moment to bridge the gap to the next moment you're trying to get to. So that's just one example of how we might look at how we label or interpret behavior, and how when we interpret it another way, it opens the door and creates space for a little more compassion and more of an intentional response versus giving us a lot of frustration, sending us into a stress response and an automatic reaction.